Ruthless cop hangs black woman in court, panics when he realizes she's the wealthy billionaire. In a courtroom meant to uphold justice, a monstrous act takes place. A racist police officer, consumed by hatred and blinded by arrogance, commits an unthinkable crime against a black woman in front of stunned onlookers. But what no one suspects, not the officer, not the judge, not even the spectators, is that his helpless victim is actually a powerful billionaire. As the gavel of the law fails to protect the innocent, a breathtaking turn of events awaits everyone who dared to underestimate her. Prepare for betrayal, shocking revelations, and the ultimate karmic retribution in this tumultuous saga that will leave you speechless. Officer Mark Donovan stood at the edge of a quiet street in Chicago's South Side, tapping his leather-gloved fingers against the handle of his flashlight. The night air was cold, biting at his cheeks. His squad car's red and blue lights were still swirling, casting an eerie glow across the deserted block. He had just pulled over a black SUV whose driver had apparently failed to signal a turn. That was Donovan's claim at least, though truthfully he'd been tailing the driver for a good 10 minutes, waiting for any minor infraction to give him a reason to pull her over. The driver, Ebony Davis, rolled down her window carefully. A well-dressed woman in her early 30s, she spoke in a clear voice that carried both confidence and a patient politeness. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" she asked calmly. She handed over her license and registration without complaint, though Donovan's rough manner, snatching the documents from her hand, made her blink in surprise. Donovan glared at her. Though Ebony wore a crisp blazer and her posture was poised, he immediately dismissed her appearance. In his mind, he had already judged her based on the color of her skin. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered gruffly. "I got reason to believe you're operating with an invalid registration." Stunned, Ebony tried to keep her cool. "But you have my registration right there. I just renewed it a month ago." Her voice was measured, but beneath it lay an undercurrent of bewilderment and slight fear. "Out!" Donovan shouted, flipping the safety strap on his holster. The threat was clear. Ebony inhaled slowly, praying for composure. She popped open her car door and slid out, hands raised to show compliance. As Donovan patted her down, Ebony's cheeks burned with shame. She noticed the smirk on his face, the way he seemed to relish exerting power over her. People from the nearby row of apartments had begun peeking through windows, some stepping out onto balconies to see the commotion. The tension in the air felt electric. Ebony reminded herself she had done nothing wrong. If this was a routine stop, she would be on her way soon. But at the back of her mind, a needle of alarm pricked, telling her this situation was far from ordinary. Donovan fiddled with her ID card for an unusually long time. "You sure this is yours?" he asked, squinting at her photo. "Yes, officer. All my paperwork is in order." Her voice remained composed, though her heart hammered in her chest. A second squad car arrived. Officer Katrina West, Donovan's longtime partner, stepped out. "What have we got?" she asked, glancing at Ebony briefly before turning her full attention to Donovan. "Counterfeit registration, I'm guessing," Donovan said, tossing Ebony's documents at West. She was driving erratically, didn't signal, tried to speed off. His tone dripped with accusatory venom, weaving a story from falsehoods. West raised an eyebrow but said nothing for a moment. She then carefully scanned Ebony's license and the registration. "This looks official," she muttered. Donovan shot West a glare, as though daring her to contradict him further. "I'll handle this," he hissed, grabbing Ebony's arm without warning. Before Ebony could protest, Donovan had twisted her arm behind her back and slapped on handcuffs. Ebony let out a small yelp of pain, but forced herself not to cry out further. She couldn't risk escalating his aggression. "What are you doing?" Ebony demanded, voice shaking. I haven't done anything." "Resisting arrest," Donovan barked. "That's another charge." By now, the small crowd watching from sidewalks and balconies had grown. A few had pulled out cell phones, recording the entire ordeal. Ebony noticed one older woman shouting, "She didn't do nothing. Let her go." But Donovan paid no heed, lifting Ebony off her feet and practically throwing her into the back of his squad car. Her car was left in the street, hazard light still blinking, as Donovan tore off into the night, Ebony inside, feeling the sting of handcuffs biting into her wrists. She recalled hearing about such incidents. She'd read the headlines, donated millions to legal funds that protected those who faced unjust profiling. But never did she dream she would be in this situation herself. She stared out the tinted window, fear wrestling with indignation. She had a philanthropic gala to attend in 2 days and was scheduled to meet with the board of her foundation that very week. None of that mattered to Donovan. In his eyes, she was just another suspect, one he was determined to break. As the police cruiser rumbled through the streets, Ebony's mind raced with questions. Would she be able to call her attorney? Would these trumped-up charges stick? She found her voice. "I want my phone call," she said, as firmly as she could manage. "You'll get it when I say so," he growled. "You talk too much. You won't even see a phone until next week." The icy finality in his words made her heart sink. But Ebony Davis knew she was not powerless. Her greatest asset had always been her resilience, her refusal to fold under pressure. Silently she began counting every detail, memorizing everything about this unlawful arrest, filing it away for the day she would finally expose Officer Donovan for his twisted tactics. And perhaps, as a small flicker of comfort in the darkness, Ebony clung to the knowledge of who she truly was. Ebony Davis, majority shareholder of Davis Continental, an investment empire with connections reaching into the highest echelons of power. She took a calming breath, resolved to fight. She had the resources, the intellect, and the unshakable will to stand up against injustice. Little did Donovan know that he had just ripped open a massive fault line beneath his own feet. And once everything came to light, that crack would become an earthquake, destroying the career and perhaps the life of the racist officer who reveled in tormenting her tonight. In the pale morning light, Ebony Davis sat on a stiff wooden bench in a cramped holding cell at the Chicago Police Department. Her wrists still bore the red marks where Donovan's handcuffs had been cruelly tightened. The cell reeked of sweat and fear, populated by a mix of individuals picked up over the past 24 hours. Ebony's mind whirled with shock, anger, and a gnawing worry. She could almost hear her attorney, David Maxwell, ranting at her over the phone. "Why didn't you call me sooner?" But Ebony hadn't even been allowed that privilege yet. Every request she'd made for a phone call was met with stonewalling or sneering from Donovan's subordinates. She suspected they were under orders from him to delay her communication with the outside world. For the first time in her life, Ebony felt the raw terror of being systematically denied her rights. Across town, in a gleaming skyscraper overlooking Lake Michigan, the Davis Continental offices were buzzing. Emily Grant, Ebony's top executive assistant and confidant, paced anxiously by her desk. She'd received a cryptic text from Ebony last night, just a single word, "Help," followed by a pinned location near the south side. Emily had tried calling Ebony's personal cell, but it rang endlessly. She tried Ebony's driver, Ebony's house manager. Nobody had seen or heard from her boss. Concern quickly turned to panic. Ebony was meticulous, always checking in if she was going to be late. Something was terribly wrong. Emily dialed the law offices of David Maxwell, Ebony's personal lawyer and old friend. "I can't find Miss Davis," she said, voice trembling. "She could be in danger." David Maxwell, an imposing man with a silver-streaked beard, listened intently. Although Ebony's philanthropic and business endeavors sometimes required discretion, it was entirely out of character for her to go off the grid. "Have you checked the city's detainment records?" David asked, steeling himself for the possibility. "Maybe she was in an accident or—" "I have," Emily replied swiftly. Her name didn't come up on any of the publicly available logs, but those logs can be updated with delays. David sighed, knuckles whitening around the phone. "I'm heading to the station now. Meet me there." Back in the holding cell, time crawled by. Ebony replayed the events of her arrest, every humiliating second. Her mind flickered with memories of the philanthropic events she'd attended in that same city, galas where she rubbed elbows with Chicago's elite, including the mayor and top police brass. She remembered introducing her scholarship program at the University of Chicago, dedicated to uplifting underprivileged youth, many of them from neighborhoods she'd grown up in. How ironic, she thought bitterly, that I've poured millions into helping communities riddled with police overreach, only to end up here myself. At last, a guard named Martinez approached, keys jangling. "Ebony Davis," he barked, scanning the cell. Ebony rose from the bench, smoothing the wrinkles out of her blazer as best she could. The door clanged open, and Martinez gestured for her to follow. "Your attorney's here." Her heart pounded. Relief flooded through her veins. Finally, a lifeline. She found David Maxwell waiting in a cramped interrogation room. He locked eyes with her. Anger and concern etched across his face. "Ebony, are you all right?" he demanded softly. She nodded stiffly, her shoulders sagging in exhaustion. "They didn't let me call you. I've never—" She paused, voice catching in her throat. "They treated me like a criminal, David." "We'll get you out of here," David said firmly. "I'm posting bail and filing a complaint against this precinct for violating your right to counsel. If Donovan or his buddies stand in our way, I'll have an injunction ready by the end of the day." A flicker of hope illuminated Ebony's expression. "Thank you," she whispered. Moments later, they were in a small side office where Ebony was officially processed. Fingerprints, mugshots, a humiliating rummaging through her personal belongings. Officer Donovan's smug face loomed in the background. He leaned against a file cabinet, arms folded, shooting ebony glares of contempt. David stepped forward, brandishing a folder of legal documents. "Where's your probable cause for arresting Mrs. Davis?" "I want the official statement," Donovan sneered, crossing one ankle over the other. "Reckless driving, falsifying registration, resisting arrest," she made threatening comments. "She did no such thing," David countered, eyes flashing with anger. "And we have dash cam footage from her vehicle and multiple phone recordings from bystanders that show she complied the entire time." "Your fancy recordings won't change a thing," Donovan snarled. "She's going to court, and she'll have to answer for her crimes." Ebony lifted her chin, forcing herself to remain calm. She refused to give Donovan the satisfaction of seeing her breakdown. Meanwhile, David continued to finalize her release, slapping paperwork down on every desk that tried to delay the process. Emily Grant arrived shortly, breathless and stricken with worry. She threw her arms around Ebony once the officers allowed them a moment of contact. Donovan, for his part, remained chillingly unruffled. He clearly believed his personal vendetta against Ebony would be justified in front of any judge. Perhaps he felt invincible, or perhaps his hatred had blinded him to the consequences. But Ebony Davis was no ordinary detainee, and the clock was ticking on Donovan's illusions of power. Finally, Ebony was given her belongings, including her phone. She quickly scanned messages from concerned colleagues and philanthropic partners. The local media had caught wind of her sudden disappearance. Some rumored she'd been involved in an accident, others speculated kidnappings or foul play. Ebony's hands shook as she texted a few close associates that she was safe for now and would call them soon with details. Stepping out of the station, Ebony blinked against the midday sun. Reporters swarmed, clamoring for a statement. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward her face. David shielded Ebony as best he could, but a few quick words were inevitable. "I'll be making a statement after speaking with my attorney," Ebony said, voice somewhat shaky, but underlined with determination. "For now, I'm thankful to be released, and I look forward to clearing my name." Within minutes, Ebony and David climbed into a sleek town car that Emily had arranged. As they pulled away, Ebony exhaled, letting the tension drain from her shoulders, if only momentarily. David glanced at her. "We're going to push back. Hard. Donovan is either woefully ignorant or truly believes he can do whatever he wants. But you have more than enough leverage. We can even call in the mayor if need be. I'll do everything in my power to ensure you're vindicated." Ebony gave a weary nod. "I appreciate it," she murmured. "But David, part of me wants to see this through. Not just for myself, but for all the people who don't have my resources. I could have easily been locked away for weeks if you and Emily hadn't showed up." David studied her face, understanding dawning in his eyes. He knew Ebony's heart. She never backed down from a fight, especially one that had a moral imperative. "All right," he said. "If that's your stance, we'll fight for more than just your acquittal. We'll demand accountability, reforms, whatever it takes to ensure this kind of abuse doesn't keep happening." For the first time that day, Ebony felt the stirrings of hope. She turned to watch Chicago's skyline flash by, a silent vow firming in her chest. She would not let Donovan's brutality go unanswered. The city she loved deserved better, and so did she. What Ebony didn't know was that Donovan, fueled by bigotry and fear of being exposed, was about to escalate matters in a way no one could have imagined. The seeds of a far darker confrontation had already been sown. The days leading up to Ebony's preliminary hearing were a whirlwind of legal filings, media interviews, and private strategy sessions. News outlets like WGN-TV Chicago and the Chicago Tribune covered the story, painting Ebony as either a victim of racial profiling or a wealthy elite seeking to exploit her power for personal gain, depending on which narrative sold better. The city was divided. Many voiced support for Ebony, while others fueled Donovan's claims that she was a privileged woman playing the race card. Within the Cook County Courthouse, tension was palpable long before the hearing began. People packed the gallery, activists, reporters, curious onlookers. Security was tight. Court officers lined the corridors, scanning for signs of protest or disruption. In a corner of the hallway, Ebony and David huddled, waiting for her case to be called. "Deep breaths," David reminded her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We have the evidence on our side. You'll be fine." Ebony swallowed hard. "I know. The media is painting me in so many different lights. I'm not even sure which version of me the public believes." She offered a small, tense laugh. David gave her a sympathetic look. "Your character speaks for itself. In the end, truth usually wins." Just then, a bailiff opened the heavy wooden doors to the courtroom. "Case of the state of Illinois versus Ebony Davis," he announced. The tension in Ebony's chest tightened, but she squared her shoulders and walked in, determined not to be intimidated. On the opposite side, Officer Mark Donovan was present, dressed in his uniform, flanked by a police union representative and a slick-faced defense attorney named Caldwell. He shot Ebony a contemptuous glare, tilting his chin up as if to say, "I have you exactly where I want you." Judge Connolly, a stern woman with a practiced scowl, rapped her gavel. "Counsel, approach for scheduling discussions." David and Caldwell approached the bench. Ebony tried to focus on David's calm, confident stance. Donovan, who remained at the defendant's table since Ebony was counterfiling charges of misconduct, stared straight ahead. Judge Connolly's voice dropped to a near whisper, but Ebony could glean the gist. The hearing would address Ebony's motion to dismiss the charges on grounds of illegal stop and racial profiling. Donovan's attorney insisted the charges should proceed to trial. Finally, the judge nodded, letting David speak at length. Ebony watched David produce documentation, Ebony's valid registration, camera footage from her SUV, clearly showing she had signaled. He also noted the many bystander videos capturing her compliance with Donovan's orders. The state's prosecution had grown noticeably uncomfortable as Donovan's story was rapidly unraveling. Ebony's relief grew with each piece of evidence. But then Donovan's lawyer, Caldwell, pulled out a last-minute statement claiming Ebony had verbally threatened Donovan during the arrest. She threatened to use her wealth and connections to destroy his career, Caldwell read, voice dripping with theatrical outrage. Ebony's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. That was an outright lie. The hearing wound on for hours. The judge, though sharp, seemed reluctant to rule on the spot. Due to new evidence and allegations, this court will schedule a full evidentiary hearing, she declared, though Ebony noticed a certain discomfort in her eyes, as if to say, something isn't right here. As Ebony, David and Emily left the courtroom, a throng of reporters rushed them. Flashes and microphones pelted Ebony from every angle. She felt a swirl of frustration. Despite her evidence, the judge refused to drop the charges immediately. At least we'll have a fair hearing, she consoled herself. Yet the courthouse vibe was far from calm. Protesters lined the steps outside, some holding signs supporting Ebony, others brandishing placards that read, "Law and order, no special treatment for the rich." Police presence was heavy, tensions crackled. Ebony felt her pulse quicken. Though she was physically free, she was chained in the public eye, both idolized and demonized. Unbeknownst to Ebony, in the warren of courthouse offices, Donovan was plotting. Furious that his false narrative was being picked apart, he cornered Caldwell in a hallway. "I can't lose this," Donovan hissed. "She's making me look like a fool. We got to put her in her place." Caldwell grimaced. "Do you have any real evidence, or are we just gambling on the judge's mood?" Donovan's eyes gleamed with a twisted resolve. "We make evidence if we have to. I got colleagues on the force who'll back me up, swear they saw her run that stop sign, maybe found something suspicious in her car. We can push a narrative that she's some big-shot drug smuggler." Caldwell looked uneasy. "Careful, lying under oath is risky, especially for cops. This woman has deep pockets for investigations." Donovan spat on the ground, face contorting with rage. "I won't be humiliated by her." And with that, he stormed away, leaving Caldwell to question just how far Donovan was willing to go. Later that afternoon, Ebony and David sat in a private conference room at David's law firm. Emily served as Ebony's eyes and ears, scanning social media for any new angles on the case. News of Donovan's meltdown at the courthouse was circulating in activist circles, though no mainstream outlet had confirmed it yet. Ebony leaned back in her chair, exhaustion lacing her voice. "He's desperate. Desperate people do reckless things." David nodded. "We'll be vigilant. We're filing additional motions tomorrow. If Donovan tries to fabricate evidence, we'll counter with motions for discovery, depositions, the works." Emily chimed in quietly. "I'm scheduling an interview on MSNBC tomorrow. Maybe a national audience can help highlight the injustice. We have philanthropic allies who want to speak up on your behalf. There's also an invitation from the Oprah Winfrey Network. They want an exclusive." Ebony pursed her lips. She'd always guarded her privacy, but this crisis demanded transparency. "Set them up. The more people that know, the safer we are." Despite her outward calm, Ebony's stomach churned. She sensed a storm brewing, as if Donovan's hateful obsession might lead him to something drastic. For all her wealth and connections, she could not stop a man unhinged. She could only keep shining light on his actions. "Evil thrives in the dark," Ebony reminded herself, recalling a quote she once read. "Illuminate it, and it can't hide." Just how bright that light would need to be became horrifyingly clear in the days that followed. Donovan's humiliating defeat in the preliminary hearing pushed him down a path of rage, culminating in a shocking plan that would stain the halls of justice themselves. And Ebony Davis, unwittingly, was set to become the sacrifice. Officer Mark Donovan paced his small living room in the run-down townhouse he called home. Discarded pizza boxes and empty beer cans littered the coffee table, testaments to sleepless nights fueled by resentment and anger. The overhead light buzzed faintly, flickering in sync with his swirling thoughts. He glared at the walls, cluttered with his old service photos, snapshots of him with a forced grin, receiving commendations for bravery and community outreach. Back then, he'd believed in a version of law enforcement that was heroic, where the badge was a symbol of pride. But he'd grown disillusioned, convinced that certain people were the source of society's downfall. Ebony Davis was just another face he could blame for the creeping sense of failure in his own life. Somewhere behind him, the television droned on about rising tensions between police and communities of color, referencing Ebony's case as an emblem of the problem. Donovan pointed the remote at the TV with white-knuckled force, turning up the volume. A local anchor rattled off Ebony's accolades, her philanthropic endeavors, her net worth rumored to be in the billions, her ties to major political players. "Billionaire?" Donovan spat under his breath. "She thinks she's above the law." In the background, the anchor credited Ebony's lawyers for showing discrepancies in Donovan's report. The broadcast implied that Ebony was poised to win her motion to dismiss. Donovan's lips curled into a silent snarl. Not if I can help it. He had one last insane plan in mind. Days earlier, Donovan had begun making calls to certain like-minded individuals within the force. A few were outraged at Ebony's claims of racial profiling, seeing them as an attack on law enforcement. Among them was Sergeant Bruce Madsen, who shared Donovan's prejudices. Madsen prided himself on old-school policing and believed modern calls for reform were a sign of societal weakness. Their quiet conspiratorial phone calls laid the groundwork for something far more sinister than false testimony. "She needs to be taught a lesson," Donovan had said in a hushed tone, and Madsen's responding grunt was enough to confirm their unholy alliance. That night, Donovan retrieved a small black bag from the trunk of his car. Inside lay the tools of hatred, rope, a gag, and other items he claimed he had seized from criminals, but never reported. He stared at the rope, the coil stark against the dark interior of the bag. It invoked the echoes of a brutal past, lynchings, murders fueled by racial terror. But Donovan was past caring about moral lines. Ebony Davis was a threat, and he was determined to rid himself of that threat in a way that would demonstrate his twisted sense of justice. In his warped mind, Donovan believed Ebony's wealth, her influence, everything she stood for, was an affront to decent people. "I'll show the world she's no goddess on a pedestal," he thought, ignoring the moral chasm opening beneath him. Meanwhile, Ebony had no clue that anything so depraved was in motion. She spent her time shuffling between high-profile interviews that David arranged, continuing her philanthropic work quietly behind the scenes. There were moments she felt uneasy, especially when unmarked police cars passed her house, or when a suspicious figure loitered near her office. "We're stepping up security," David assured her, recommending a private detail of armed guards. Ebony reluctantly agreed, though she loathed the idea of living barricaded behind walls of protection. In one particularly tense meeting with her foundation's board, Ebony could hardly focus on the budgets and program expansions being discussed. Her mind kept wandering to the upcoming hearing, the hateful glare on Donovan's face, the vile threat in his final words the last time they locked eyes in court. "You'll regret crossing me." It reverberated in her thoughts like a broken record. As Ebony stood to leave the boardroom, her cell phone buzzed. A blocked number. She hesitated, then answered. A raspy voice spoke, a man's voice, heavy with contempt. "You think we don't know who you are? Your billions won't save you. Go back to where you came from." Her breath caught in her throat. She managed to squeak out, "Who is this?" But the line went dead. She stared at the screen, hands shaking. The board members noticed her distress, but Ebony played it off as just a spam call. Inside, though, alarm bells rang. She relayed the incident to David that evening, who insisted on upgrading her phone's security and notifying the police of a threatening call. Ebony's private detail also tripled in vigilance. The day of Ebony's next court appearance loomed. It would be a decisive hearing regarding the dismissal of charges and the reveal of Ebony's official countersuit for racial profiling, unlawful arrest, and police brutality. Every local news station was stoking the public's fascination with the high-stakes drama. What Ebony couldn't fathom was Donovan's ultimate plan for that day. He had enough connections to arrange partial control over court security. Sergeant Madsen, scheduled to be on duty at the courthouse, had quietly manipulated the roster to ensure certain key positions were manned by officers friendly to Donovan. The stage was set. On the night before the hearing, Donovan sat in his dark living room, staring at the rope again. Heart pounding with a mix of excitement and twisted resolve, he thought of Ebony walking into that courtroom, walking into the jaws of his carefully orchestrated trap. She wants to play in the big leagues? She'll see what real power looks like, he told himself. He flicked the TV back on, scanning news segments about Ebony's philanthropic gala next month. His lip curled as he saw footage of Ebony shaking hands with community leaders, hugging underprivileged children who were beneficiaries of her foundation. "Faker," he mumbled. He grabbed a half-empty bottle of whiskey, taking a deep swig. "It's me or her," the whiskey told him. In his mania, Donovan believed Ebony was the root of his downfall, and that he had no choice but to eradicate her. For Ebony, the night was spent in restless sleep, haunted by nightmares of being chased through cold, echoing hallways by a shadowy figure with glowing eyes. She'd wake with a start, telling herself it was just anxiety over the trial. "Tomorrow we'll set things right," she kept repeating, as if chanting a mantra. "Tomorrow, truth prevails." But sometimes evil slithers through the cracks of the very system meant to stop it. And in the fluorescent-lit corridors of the Cook County Courthouse, evil was about to strike in its most dreadful form. Court day dawned grey and overcast, as if the city itself sensed something dark on the horizon. The Cook County Courthouse teemed with activity, lawyers huddled over briefs, clerks rushing about, and armed security scanning everyone who entered. Among the throng of people and metal detectors, Ebony Davis arrived, flanked by David Maxwell and 2 private security guards. Concern etched David's face as he observed the unusual tension in the corridors. "Is it always this intense?" Ebony asked, glancing around. The last time she'd come it was crowded, but not oppressively so. David scanned the hallway. "It's definitely heightened today. Could be the media coverage, or perhaps local activists showing up. Let's keep our guard up." Reporters lined the hallway leading to the courtroom. Ebony offered no comment, stepping briskly through. David guided her to a private room, checking in with the clerk that they were ready for their hearing. The clerk looked flustered, pointing to a jam-packed schedule. "Judge Connolly is finishing up an earlier case. We're running behind." Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the building, Donovan was also present. But instead of waiting near the courtroom like a normal defendant in a misconduct case, he lingered near the courthouse security checkpoint, conferring with Sergeant Madsen in hushed tones. Madsen nodded gravely, glancing at the rope discreetly concealed in Donovan's duffel bag. The 2 men quickly parted ways. Madsen continuing onto the security station, Donovan slipping into a stairwell that led to a restricted area of the building. If any guard questioned him, Donovan would simply flash his badge, claiming special police business. Back in the private waiting room, Ebony tried to review her statements with David. She was prepared to speak on the stand about the night of her arrest and the subsequent intimidation attempts. But her voice kept betraying her, trembling with nervous energy. David leaned forward, taking her hand. "It's going to be okay," he said softly. "We've got the truth on our side." She swallowed, nodding. "I keep telling myself that. Something just feels off." A knock at the door made them both jump. It was the bailiff, face impassive. "Judge Connolly is ready. She wants everyone in the courtroom now." When Ebony stepped into the courtroom, a hush fell. Spectators crammed the benches. She noticed multiple uniformed officers seated in the gallery, an unusually large contingent. A ripple of whispers spread as Ebony took her place at the plaintiff's table alongside David. Caldwell, Donovan's lawyer, sat opposite, but Donovan was nowhere to be seen. "Where's Officer Donovan?" Ebony murmured, scanning the room. David frowned, also perplexed. Judge Connolly looked at Caldwell expectantly. Caldwell rose, an unsteady smile on his face. "Your Honor, my client had to respond to a last-minute work emergency. We request a brief recess." Before the judge could respond, the doors behind Ebony's table burst open. A policeman Ebony didn't recognize, a heavy-set man with a sergeant's stripes, strode in with a metal chain in his hands. Another officer followed, leveling a gun at Ebony's private security detail. Shouts erupted in the courtroom. The judge banged her gavel. "What is the meaning of this?" Judge Connolly demanded. Pandemonium ensued. Spectators screamed. The clerk leaped from her seat. David rushed to Ebony, trying to shield her with his body. But more officers, presumably Donovan's allies, forced their way in, cornering Ebony's security guards. The firearms were real, and the threat was chilling. In the chaos, Ebony's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. She saw Caldwell stepping back, hands raised, clearly just as shocked. This was not part of any normal legal proceeding. The judge stood up, face ashen, as she yelled for order, but no one complied. Suddenly, Donovan appeared from the adjacent hallway, his features twisted into a mask of hatred. In his hand was a coil of rope. Gasps and shrieks tore through the gallery as onlookers realized the horrifying implication. Ebony's heart hammered in her chest. This cannot be real. This cannot be happening in a courtroom. "This woman is a threat to law and order," Donovan declared in a booming voice. He pointed at Ebony. "She's here to tear down everything we stand for." Judge Connolly, her voice trembling, threatened to hold Donovan and his cohorts in contempt. "Officer Donovan, stand down. You have no authority." But Donovan's eyes gleamed, and Ebony knew reason would not prevail here. In a flash, Donovan lunged forward. David tried to block him, but Donovan slammed him aside, ripping Ebony out of her seat. The rope was tossed around Ebony's neck before she could even scream. Panic soared through her. The thick, coarse fibers chafed her skin. She managed a choked cry as she was dragged to the front of the courtroom. People scrambled to intervene, but they were blocked by the armed officers who had effectively seized control of the space. Judge Connolly frantically ordered the bailiffs to intervene, but Madsen and his men brandished weapons at them. "Stay back!" they roared, adrenaline fueling their madness. Ebony's vision blurred with terror. Her mind raced. This isn't real. This can't be real. But the rope biting into her neck was dreadfully real. She clawed at Donovan's hands, desperately trying to breathe. The entire courtroom watched, horrified, as Donovan pushed Ebony onto a low wooden bench, tying the rope around an overhead beam that supported the ornate ceiling fan fixture. The symbolism of a noose in an American courthouse was not lost on a single soul present. Screams pierced the air. Cameras flashed wildly. Reporters were capturing the unfathomable. Ebony gasped for air, the rope tightening. Donovan barked orders at Madsen, who controlled the crowd with his gun. Ebony felt her lungs burn. The world started to spin. In that moment of extreme clarity, Ebony thought of her mother, who taught her to never give in to bullies. She thought of the scholarships she had funded for talented black youth. She thought of how she had believed in the system to eventually bring Donovan to justice. That faith was now shattered, replaced by a horror that such a monstrous act could happen in the very hall of justice. As Ebony's strength ebbed, a voice rang out. "Enough!" a woman cried. Judge Connolly, her gavel falling uselessly from her hand. Connolly took a bold step forward. "You can't do this!" she shouted, tears streaking her face. But Donovan stared at her with dead eyes, ignoring her pleas. Suddenly, Ebony's private security detail made a desperate move. Despite being outgunned, one guard lunged at Madsen, causing the sergeant's gun to discharge into the ceiling. Smoke and plaster rained down, scattering the crowd in renewed chaos. The second guard rushed Donovan. Shots rang out again. Ebony, dizzy and barely conscious, felt Donovan's grip loosen. In the swirl of confusion, David Maxwell crashed into Donovan from the side, tackling him to the floor. Ebony tumbled off the bench, the rope still around her neck but no longer taut. She gasped in air, tears streaming down her cheeks as she sprawled on the cold marble floor. Pandemonium reigned. Officers and bailiffs traded blows, trying to wrest control from Donovan's conspirators. The next thing Ebony remembered was a beeping sound, steady, repetitive. She opened her eyes groggily, blinking at the harsh white light overhead. A hospital room. An oxygen mask was strapped to her face, the hiss of flowing air steady in her ears. Her throat ached like she'd swallowed razor blades. A gentle voice called her name. "Ebony, Ebony, can you hear me?" She turned her head, eyes focusing on David Maxwell, who sat in a chair by her bedside. Relief washed over his face as he saw her stirring. "You're safe now," he said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. Ebony tried to speak, but the attempt ended in a raspy squeak. "Don't strain," David cautioned gently. "Doctors say you'll need a few days for your throat to heal." Ebony forced a nod, tears brimming in her eyes as memories flooded back. The rope, Donovan's twisted rage, the gunshots. She squeezed David's hand, silently grateful to be alive. The nurse entered, checking Ebony's vitals. She offered a reassuring smile, telling Ebony she was lucky her injuries weren't worse. Ebony tried to mouth a thank you. An hour passed in near silence, Ebony drifting in and out of a shocked haze. Then Emily Grant knocked softly on the door, her eyes red from crying. She rushed to Ebony's side, hugging her gently. "We've all been so worried," she whispered. Ebony nodded, tears slipping free. Emily patted her hand, sniffing back her own sobs. Outside Ebony's hospital room, the world had erupted in outrage. Headlines screamed about the near lynching that occurred inside a Chicago courtroom. National news stations plastered Donovan's mugshot across the screen. The FBI had launched an immediate investigation into the infiltration of racist elements within the police force. It was a scandal of epic proportions. The images of Ebony, a rope around her neck in the seat of justice, had ignited protests nationwide. Crowds demanded an overhaul of law enforcement. Politicians scrambled to condemn the atrocity. Donovan and his accomplices were charged with a litany of crimes, including attempted murder, conspiracy, and hate crimes. Videos from the reporters present in the courtroom served as undeniable evidence. Even Caldwell, Donovan's lawyer, publicly denounced Donovan's actions, claiming he had no knowledge of any plan to harm Ebony. For Ebony, the emotional toll was immense. Each time she closed her eyes, she relived the horrifying moment when her airway was squeezed shut. She replayed Donovan's hateful sneer. Physically, she was on the mend, but mentally, she was far from okay. Waves of anxiety and panic threatened to overwhelm her whenever she heard a raised voice or sudden sound. David sat quietly, reading her the statements of support pouring in from around the world. Celebrities, activists, Fortune 500 CEOs, and even the White House. Oprah Winfrey herself called Ebony's recovery room, leaving a voice message expressing deep sorrow and pledging to amplify Ebony's story. Ebony was touched, but also overwhelmed. She never wanted to be a symbol of tragedy, or worse, a symbol of racial terror. 2 days later, Ebony felt strong enough to speak a few words, her voice hoarse and gravelly. "Press conference," she managed to David. He shook his head vehemently. "Ebony, rest first. There's no rush." She took a shaky breath. "Need to speak publicly. So, no spin." He understood. She wanted to control the narrative, to ensure the truth shone through. That evening, a podium was set up in the hospital's small auditorium. The press was invited under strict guidelines, only a limited number of cameras and journalists. Ebony, still wearing a hospital gown beneath a loose sweater, stepped carefully into the room, her security detail close. Photographers snapped away. Ebony's bruises were visible, the rope burn around her neck still stark. David guided her to the microphone stand. The hush in the room was profound, like everyone held their breath in reverence for what she had endured. Ebony swallowed, wincing at the pain, then spoke slowly and clearly. "I am grateful to be alive," she began, her voice ragged. She paused, letting the reality sink in for them all. What happened in that courtroom was a horrific attack, not just on me, but on the very idea of justice. Reporters scribbled furiously. The cameras zoomed in on the bruises. Ebony pressed on, determined to speak despite the pain. We cannot allow hate to masquerade as law enforcement. We must demand accountability." She took a shaky breath, tears threatening, but she pushed through. "I'm committed, more than ever, to using my resources to fight this kind of vile racism." She concluded with a faint but resolute, "Thank you," stepping back as the crowd rose in a spontaneous ovation. In that moment, Ebony's ordeal transcended personal tragedy. It became a rallying point for systemic change. When Ebony returned to her hospital room, she collapsed into a fitful sleep, dreams haunted by Donovan's glare. She woke in the middle of the night, gasping, tears soaking her pillow. But the next morning brought a glimmer of hope amid the turmoil. The Department of Justice announced a sweeping investigation into the Chicago Police Department, with an emphasis on extremist infiltration. The mayor publicly vowed to clean house. Supporters rallied outside the hospital, chanting Ebony's name in solidarity. Flowers, cards, and messages of love inundated her. For the first time since the attack, Ebony dared to believe that from this horror, something transformative might emerge. But Ebony's path to healing remained steep. Each day required a fight against nightmares, flashbacks, and the painful realization that her illusions of safety were shattered. Yet in her darkest moments, she clung to the same fortitude that had driven her from humble beginnings to billionaire success. She resolved to see Donovan punished to the fullest extent of the law, not out of personal vengeance, but as a statement that hate would not go unchallenged. And Donovan would indeed face his reckoning. Caged in a cell of his own, he'd come to grasp that the system he thought he'd weaponized against Ebony was turning against him, exposing the festering corruption that he and his cronies represented. In the months following the trial, Ebony Davis threw herself into activism and systemic reform, determined that her near-death experience would serve as a catalyst for genuine change. She worked closely with local and national organizations, leveraging her influence to pressure lawmakers to pass comprehensive police accountability legislation. One of her first major steps was forming a coalition called Bridges for Justice. With Ebony's philanthropic resources as a foundation, the coalition united civil rights leaders, community organizers, and forward-thinking law enforcement officers who wanted to cleanse their ranks of racism. Ebony traveled to Washington, D.C., meeting with congressional leaders, lobbying for federal oversight and stricter regulations on police misconduct. Though the road ahead was long, Ebony's bold presence turned heads in the nation's capital. In Chicago, Ebony invested in pilot programs aimed at bridging the gap between police departments and marginalized communities. She funded scholarships for prospective officers from diverse backgrounds, hoping to cultivate a new generation of policing rooted in empathy. She also donated to mental health support for officers, recognizing that stress, while never an excuse for hatred, could be mitigated to prevent radicalization. All the while, Ebony remained acutely aware of her own healing process. Therapy sessions delved into the trauma of that day in court. Nightmares still woke her at times, leaving her gasping and in tears, but slowly she found ways to cope. She founded a support group for survivors of hate crimes, an intimate setting where people could share stories, find solace, and strategize ways to fight back against oppression. Meanwhile, the media continued to shine a spotlight on her. Some labeled her a modern civil rights champion, while others whispered about her ulterior motives. But Ebony had long ago learned to navigate public perception. The voices of cynics did not deter her, not when she saw tangible progress. Lower tensions in certain neighborhoods, dialogues between police and residents that had never occurred before, and small but meaningful policy changes at City Hall. One afternoon, Ebony visited the Southside Community Center she had opened years prior. She walked through the hallways, greeted by children taking after-school classes, painting murals, and playing music. A group of middle schoolers stopped her, eyes wide with awe. One shy girl spoke up, "Thank you for being so brave. You're a hero." Ebony knelt, meeting the girl's gaze. "I'm just someone who refused to stay silent. But you can be brave too." all of you." She offered a kind smile, patting the girl's shoulder. "We each have power to change our world." The girl beamed, as did her friends, and Ebony felt a surge of gratitude. Moments like this reaffirmed her purpose, reminding her why she fought so hard, even at the risk of her own life. The city's transformation, while far from complete, was underway. Donovan's trial had ignited a wave of courage among victims of police misconduct to speak out. Multiple other corrupt officers were exposed and indicted. Some within the CPD, who had previously turned a blind eye, now championed stricter internal reviews. Public trust began to inch upward as a new generation of officers, bolstered by Ebony's scholarships, swore their oaths with genuine commitment to protect and serve all citizens. At times, Ebony wondered if Donovan sat in his prison cell, watching the news coverage of these reforms. She suspected it might torment him, knowing his heinous act had not destroyed her, but rather propelled her to become a powerful agent of change. Part of her hoped it did eat away at him, not out of spite, but so he could grasp how profoundly he had miscalculated. During a conference at the University of Chicago, where Ebony was invited to speak on justice reform, she was approached by the newly appointed police commissioner. He extended a handshake, face solemn. "Miss Davis, I want to apologize personally for how our institution failed you." Ebony looked him in the eye. "I appreciate your words, Commissioner. But real change will come from actions, not apologies." He nodded. "That's exactly why I'm here. I'd like to collaborate with your foundation on training programs focused on de-escalation and racial bias." Her heart stirred with cautious optimism. "I'm listening." After the conference, Ebony walked along the campus quad, remembering her early days in business, how she once roamed these very halls with big dreams. She never imagined that fighting entrenched racism in law enforcement would become such a huge part of her legacy. But life had taken her down this path, and she embraced it wholeheartedly. A message buzzed on her phone, an invitation to speak at the Oprah Winfrey Network next month, an extended interview about her journey from victim to activist. Another message pinged in from a senator's office, requesting her testimony at an upcoming hearing on police reform. Ebony exhaled, the weight of her mission feeling both exhilarating and exhausting. Through it all, Ebony found joy in the small victories, like watching a teenage scholarship recipient graduate from the police academy with honors, or seeing an entire precinct adopt new community-friendly protocols. Bit by bit, the city was changing, hardly perfect, but evolving. That night, Ebony stared at the reflection of her faint scar in the mirror. She still wore it like a badge, a reminder that she was a survivor. She pressed her fingers gently against it, recalling the terror in that courtroom. But now, the memory fueled her resolve rather than crippling her with fear. Her phone rang. David Maxwell. She answered with a smile, stepping out onto her balcony overlooking Chicago's glittering skyline. "I have news," David said. "I just got off the phone with the Department of Justice. They're considering naming you to a federal oversight committee on police reform." Ebony closed her eyes for a moment, letting the gravity of that sink in. The wealthy black woman once dragged in for a bogus traffic stop, nearly lynched in open court, was now being asked to help reshape the nation's policing standards. If that isn't poetic justice, I don't know what is, she thought. With a grateful heart and a weary but hopeful spirit, Ebony Davis stood on that balcony, gazing at the city lights. She knew her battle was far from over, but she also knew she was never alone. A chorus of voices, community activists, honest officers, everyday citizens, joined her in demanding a fairer, safer society. And for the first time in a long while, Ebony felt a profound sense of peace, that her survival had purpose, her scars had meaning. The day Ebony Davis stepped into the White House for the Medal of Freedom ceremony felt surreal. Not long ago, she had faced a death sentence at the hands of a bigoted policeman in a Chicago courtroom. Now she entered the grand halls of power, draped in an elegant charcoal suit, greeted by dignitaries and lawmakers who applauded her achievements. In the East Room, cameras flashed, music played, and Ebony joined a lineup of other honorees, writers, activists, and scientists, each recognized for impactful contributions to society. The president, a tall figure with a warm smile, approached Ebony. "Ms. Davis," he said, voice echoing through the chamber, "you've shown America that resilience and justice can overcome hatred. Your courage, after facing an unspeakable act of violence, has not only inspired this nation, but helped shape new laws and reforms. For that, we honor you." A roar of applause followed as the president placed the medal around Ebony's neck. She bowed her head humbly, tears brimming in her eyes. She scanned the crowd, spotting David and Emily beaming at her. In that moment, Ebony felt the circle of her journey closing. From near death to national recognition, from victim to victor, all in a whirlwind year. After the ceremony, Ebony made her way to a press conference in the Rose Garden, joined by the other recipients. When reporters asked about her next steps, Ebony replied with unflinching determination, "This medal is not the end of my work. It's a reminder that I carry the responsibility to continue fighting for justice, for everyone still facing oppression." Back in Chicago, Donovan's sentencing hearing took place a week later. He faced multiple life sentences for the various federal charges. Ebony attended via video link. She refused to be in the same room as him again, but wanted to bear witness to the final chapter of his trial. The judge, referencing the monstrous nature of the courthouse attack, handed down the maximum penalties. Donovan stared at the camera broadcasting Ebony's image, a haunted look in his eyes. She regarded him in silence, feeling neither pity nor glee, only the weight of a tragedy that needn't have happened if hatred hadn't taken root in his heart. Outside the courthouse, cameras caught Ebony's reaction to Donovan's sentencing. She gave a concise statement, her voice calm and resolute. "Justice doesn't always come quickly, and it doesn't erase the trauma. But I believe this verdict sends a message that racism and violence have no place in our society. My hope is that we learn from this painful chapter and commit ourselves to forging a future where acts of hate are unthinkable." In the weeks after Donovan's sentencing, Ebony returned to her philanthropic routines, but with renewed fervor. She championed job training programs for at-risk youth, opened more community centers, and funded conflict resolution training in police departments across multiple states. The Ebony Davis Foundation soared in reputation, drawing donors from global corporations impressed by her authenticity and unyielding drive for social justice. Karma had struck Donovan and his conspirators hard. They languished behind bars, ostracized even among fellow inmates. Meanwhile, Ebony's influence blossomed. She was asked to speak at international forums on human rights. Her story resonated in places where systemic oppression still thrived. She offered hope that no matter how entrenched bigotry might be, it could be challenged by determined individuals refusing to be silenced. One evening, as Ebony dined with David and Emily at an upscale restaurant near the Magnificent Mile, she caught sight of herself reflected in the mirrored wall. She still wore the faint scar on her neck, yet she held her head high. That scar, once a symbol of terror, had become a testament to her survival, a reminder that she had confronted death in a place meant for justice and emerged stronger, forging a new path for countless others. Toward the end of dinner, Emily raised a glass of sparkling water. "To Ebony," she said, voice thick with emotion, "and to the unstoppable wave of change she's unleashed." David chimed in, "May we all keep riding that wave, in the courtroom, in Congress, and in every community that desperately needs it." Ebony smiled, clinking her glass against theirs. "Here's to never giving in to hate," she said quietly, "and to using every bit of privilege we have to lift others up." They toasted amid the soft hum of Chicago nightlife. In that moment, Ebony recognized the karmic balance that had come full circle. Donovan tried to hang her for her skin color and her wealth, hoping to prove she was beneath him. Instead, he ended up hanging his own future. Ebony, far from broken, had ascended to new heights of moral and civic leadership. That was the ultimate rebuke to bigotry, a life lived boldly, abundantly, and in service to justice. Thank you for joining us on this intense emotional journey of courage, survival, and ultimate triumph. Ebony Davis's story reminds us that hatred thrives in the shadows, but it collapses under the scrutiny of determined hearts. From the depths of a terrifying courthouse attack to standing victorious on the national stage, Ebony's unbreakable spirit turned tragedy into transformation, not just for herself, but for an entire community seeking change. Now, it's your turn to keep that momentum alive. If her story moved you, consider sharing this video, leaving a comment about your thoughts, or subscribing to stay connected with more powerful stories of justice and resilience. Together, let's shine a spotlight on injustice and ignite positive change in our world. Remember, your voice matters, and every act of compassion adds to the unstoppable wave of transformation. Like, share, and subscribe, and keep the fight for justice alive.